Hello, hello. This is the My Artifact episode number 3717. Today's date is 26th of November. Sorry, 22 of November 2025. It's been almost like a morning at 7:14 a.m. All right, let's just jump into the question. Let's go. All right, the question is, what if startup solve world problem by default? Okay, that's a really good question. Okay, first of all, what exactly is this question, and why am I asking this question to myself? This is what if question. Why am I asking this question to myself? What if question is always really interested way to give the answer. It kind of like a force you to think about that reality. When I try to think about that reality, I try to utilize my knowledge and information for kind of like creating this reality. And somehow when I try to utilize my knowledge and information, it felt really good. It's not a kind of like a some typical kind of like a question that has a kind of like a stagnant answer, like 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. No, this kind of like a question is a kind of like a only multiples of answer. It depends on how you kind of like determine that answer. Okay, yeah, like basically the question is that why not 4 plus 2 is equal to 3. Okay, yeah. When I ask this question, then probably you just have to understand what is actually meaning of value of plus, what is actually meaning of value of 2, 3, 4. So then you try to verify and things like that. And somehow it kind of like a somebody getting more value than conventional answer. And that's why what if question is kind of like a little bit more interested way to give the answer. Disclaimer, the information that I'm trying to tell you is not exactly right or is not exactly wrong either. Okay, it's raw, it's unfiltered, it is just my opinion. So do not believe in any kind of information that I'm saying, or do not seek for any kind of information that I'm saying. It is raw, it's unfiltered, it is just my opinion, and opinion are subjective. All right, now let's proceed further. Now regarding about the question says, what if startups solve world problem by default? Okay, that's a really good question. Okay, first of all, is startup is actually solving the problem? Like, first of all, what is actually startup? Okay, yeah, if you not really associate with any kind of like some business stuff, let me clarify what is actually startup. A startup means like that a kind of like a some idea, a kind of like a some business idea that you wanted to kind of like a some create something, a kind of like a company after that. Like example is this thing, I have a startup idea regarding about, I wanted to make a application regarding about my artifact, or kind of like my application is kind of like something meant for people to kind of like simply people express their thoughts and things and that, which kind of like somebody help so that people who kind of like somebody getting a lot of stress and things. Artifact is kind of like simply solving that problem, because when people will kind of like record their artifact, they will kind of like simply not have that much amount of stress and things like that, even if they've been through any kind of like situation. Artifact has a kind of like a somebody problem that they could kind of like somebody remove the stress and things, okay, yeah, of the people. So this is kind of like a problem that I have on an artifact. It's kind of my application is kind of like solving them. So this is kind of like somebody the problem, and startup is actually solving that there. Okay, yeah. Now let's talk about the SpaceX too. Okay, yeah. SpaceX is also a company who kind of like somebody solve the problem regarding about the reusable rocket. Like basically, first of all, rocket are like basically when we try to send some sort of anything out of Earth orbit, then probably it's very costly. Because of that, the rockets that they are using are that they are meant to be utilized only once, and they will not able to use it again. Why? Because our rockets are a bit more heavy and bit more kind of like assembly very difficult to reuse again. Because when the rocket are kind of like assembly, okay, let me clarify what is actually rocket, what exactly it means. Okay, so basically this thing rocket means like not just a kind of like a rocket. A rocket, a kind of like assembly is this thing, a kind of like a booster who can kind of like assembly let any kind of like a something like kind of like a spaceship out of the orbit. That is called rocket. So rocket is not the entire thing. Rocket is a kind of like simply the bottom part that can kind of like put a space thing, a space ship into the kind of like into the space. Now that bottom thing is called rocket. Now why we cannot reuse that rocket again? because of that, ki rocket is kind of like assembly. When the rocket is kind of like assembly arrive at some certain above the distance of the surface, it should supposed to be eject. Now when that rocket eject from the spaceship, then spaceship is kind of like assembly proceed the kind of like assembly proceed the forward mechanism, like basically the spaceship went ahead, but the rocket cannot. Okay, because rocket doesn't really have that thing, rocket doesn't really have that technology, rocket doesn't really do anything at all. So basically rocket is actually fall down. Okay, yeah. So basically when the rocket is actually fall down from almost like a 5,000 or 6,000 kilometer from the surface area, from our surface, then probably it can fall down and to the very rapid speed. And when it actually happened, at most of the time our earth atmosphere is actually burn that particular rocket, or if it not burn, then probably it's very hard to recover. Because of that key, it's cannot, you cannot recover the rocket. So basically you cannot reuse the rocket. Okay, yeah. So that's why the everything that you should supposed to be send to the space is kind of like a very much expensive. SpaceX is kind of like a somebody find this problem and kind of like a solve this problem. SpaceX is kind of like a somebody try to do this, a kind of like a somebody such a rocket that kind of like a reusable rocket. That rocket should supposed to be kind of like a reuse again and again, so that we should supposed to be kind of like a somebody the sending some sort of people or object should supposed to be very cost effective, so that everyone should supposed to be utilize space and things and that and that. Okay, yeah. That's why kind of like SpaceX is actually kind of like solving problems. Okay, yeah. Now Amazon is also kind of like solving problems too. First of all is that people need so many things, and probably if we need so many things, we might not have that many things. Let's just say I am belong to the kind of like a local city, and I need a kind of like a something, let's just say a badminton racket, a badminton racket which is kind of like a something Yonex, which kind of like a something bit more better and things like that. Now because I'm kind of like a living in kind of like a somebody local city, we are having this kind of like a somebody a very specific kind of like a badminton racket. I don't really get it. So how do I supposed to get it? E-commerce website Amazon came. Amazon is kind of like a somebody bringing that whatever the racket, what is the badminton racket to me. It kind of like a delivered that racket from kind of like a somebody the where it actually available to me, and which kind of like a somebody really helpful for me. Because of that I shouldn't supposed to be go kind of like a somebody another city and bring the racket and things and that and that. So basically this thing, every startup is kind of like somebody solving some sort of problem. Okay, yeah. Now at the moment there are a couple of kind of like startup who kind of like somebody solve bigger problem. Like let's just say SpaceX, who's kind of like somebody solving the kind of like a space problem. Okay, yeah, which is kind of like a really big problem. Okay, yeah. Then Amazon and another kind of like assembly application who's kind of like solving the couple of problem. Okay, yeah, but still is this thing. Those are kind of like assembly problems are kind of like assembly solve very like a very less space are actually very less company who are actually kind of like assembly exist who actually solve this kind of like assembly the big problem like a SpaceX does and things like that. Okay, there are so many kind of like assembly companies are actually exist too, but still very less as compared to the kind of like a normal company who kind of like assembly wanted to make an app like me, like basically the way that I'm making the app and things like that. Okay, yeah, like basically this thing does my kind of like assembly solving problem like does artifact is kind of like assembly solve the problem, is not the kind of like assembly world problem and things like that. Well, it is also world problem too, but still it's kind of like assembly is this thing that key. The problem is that the SpaceX is actually run by Elon Musk, and Elon Musk is already a rich person. So probably is this thing because of he was actually very rich person, he might kind of like solve such a problem that kind of like only matter to the humanity to things and that. Compared to me, I am not that rich person. I don't really have anything at all. So completely is this thing. My kind of like only mostly what kind of like a problem should I supposed to be solved is kind of like a depend upon how much I should supposed to solve the problem. Example is this thing that I also realize that pollution and kind of like air pollution is kind of like solving so much. Basically this thing crippling our kind of like some life and things like that. Like every time I kind of like went outside, every roadside I kind of like seen the plastic and things and that. I kind of like somebody have an idea. What if I would kind of like somebody that collecting the garbage, or maybe kind of like a things. If I started kind of like collecting garbage or things or that and that, what if I could do this thing? Can I able to do that thing? Well, yes, I able to do that thing. but financially I am not, because I don't really have that much amount of money, backup, support system, and anything at all. What I'm trying to tell you is this thing that when you try to solve a bigger problem, you need a kind of like a bigger support system, not only just the money, but as well as kind of like some other things like support from the governments and things and that, and then and only then you could solve that particular problem. Okay, yeah. The problem is that today is also kind of like a startup is actually exist, but they are actually solving such a problem that kind of like simply recommend to the small things. Okay, let's just say that which AI kind of like simply better for you. So basically I have to kind of like make a kind of like a company who kind of like understand that what is actually your purpose of your uses of AI, and it kind of like recommend you one of the best AI for me. Let's just say I'm kind of like my purpose of using AI is kind of like image generation. So basically this thing, my application or my website is kind of like a recommend to you to kind of like use uh, uh, Google Nano Banana, or kind of like simply the Gem, kind of like a DALL-E or Mid Journey. These are kind of like simply AI kind of like a best for image generation. Okay, let's just say I need a kind of like simply writing, like basically this thing, I kind of like simply create a lot of documents and things and that. So basically which AI is actually best for me? So AI will kind of my kind of like application will kind of like recommend me that use Claude or use ChatGPT. These are kind of like a best for writing or things like that. Okay, so basically this thing that basically my startup company is actually kind of like essentially solve a very simple problem. Okay, yeah, not kind of like a world bigger problem and things like that. And why I'm not kind of like a solving bigger problem? Because of that money and things like that. Because obviously this thing really required kind of like a so much amount of money and right, so much amount of money to kind of like solve the big problem. Now this is not just the only one thing to kind of like stopping me the kind of like a world big problem. No, there are kind of like a couple of factor to kind of like assembly responsible for stopping me to kind of like assembly bigger problem. And what is that? Money. Okay, as I mentioned is this thing that money is something really essential. It's not just kind of like simply depend on what is actually your startup company solve the problem. It's actually depend on how much you actually earn money. Okay, example is this thing that if you decided that I wanted to kind of like simply remove the plastic from this and that, so probably is this thing, I need a support from the government, I need a lot of amount of money, I need multiple things and stuff like that. Okay, yeah. And if I able to do this thing, it's not gonna happen because of I need a lot of amount of money. Another thing is that most of the kind of like assembly the in startup usually depends on the funding, depend on kind of like assembly investor. Because of that, those are investor are want their money back. Even if I have kind of like assembly very much amount of kind of like assembly ethics regarding about solving the world problem and things like that, but investor doesn't really kind of like invest regarding about my idea. They are actually invest regarding about their money. Like basically they think if your kind of like application or your website or whatever you do is kind of like a bit really profitable, only and only they will gonna invest the money. They will not gonna invest money regarding about that how good is your plan, what kind of like a sort of world problem that you solve and things and that. No, because investor wants money like a basically in profit, also quick, also in kind of like a fast. Okay, they don't want to wait, they don't want to kind of like a wait for almost another decade and kind of like a somebody their money should supposed to double and things and that. It's not gonna happen. And when you try to solve the world big problem, then probably is this thing, the patience is one of the very really essential thing you have to put. And startup is kind of like really failing in that, because startup is kind of like mainly focus on kind of like sudden growth and kind of like focus on kind of like expensive growth and things like that. Okay, yeah. So it's kind of like a things. Okay, that's why startup company is kind of like fail to kind of like solve big problem, because the money is a big problem, support is also a big problem, also the investor is also a big problem too, because it really required kind of like patience, and kind of like a startup company doesn't really have that much patience. Okay, because investor wants profit more, growth more. Okay, they don't want to kind of like a patience and things and that. Okay, and that is what kind of like assembly it creates a problem. So that's why most of the kind of like a startup company cannot able to kind of like solve the kind of like a bigger problem and things like that. Okay, now you understand what I'm trying to tell you. Okay, now basically the question is that what if the startup is actually solve the world problem by default? What exactly it means? It means that what if that kind of like the startup company who actually solve the problem regarding about having less amount of money or things or that, what if such thing happened, then what would be that particular world? Okay, then first of all, if such thing will gonna happen, then probably one of the important thing is that na ki most of the kind of like a startup companies actually kind of like a somebody decided uh, rely not only just for funding and money, it kind of like a funding, it kind of like a somebody fund on their kind of like a somebody idea that they have, or kind of like a how do they execute and things like that. Example is this thing. I'm from India, and basically this thing, every time I kind of like a simply wake up, every time I kind of like a went outside, I kind of like a seen a lot of plastic in the roadside, which is kind of like a simply very crippled because of that key. It doesn't really feel really good. It kind of like a somebody feel that key, no, this kind of like a plastic should supposed to be removed and things like that. So basically, what should I supposed to do? Should I supposed to hire so many people to kind of like somebody collecting all those garbage and kind of like a things and that? Well, probably we do have this thing. We also have kind of like a simply cleaning people who kind of like a clean that sting, but they are kind of like a not really doing that work really well. And as also they are also not really getting that much kind of like a simply, it's not kind of like a simply very effective solution. Okay, yeah. So how do I supposed to solve that problem? How do I supposed to do this thing? Because it actually kind of like a very big problem, and my idea is kind of like a simply solving that particular thing. So how do I supposed to do this thing? Okay, yeah. So my idea is that probably is this thing, instead of kind of like a somebody the cleaning people who actually clean that particular kind of like a somebody the plastic and things like that, instead of people can do this thing. How does people can do this thing? And people like does people can kind of like a somebody collect the garbage and things like that, or kind of like a somebody helping the garbage and things like that? Yes, they will. You have to be kind of like a somebody telling in a kind of like a very different way. Example is this thing. My problem is kind of like a solve something very differently. Let's just say that I'm gonna create an application. In this application, a normal user can kind of like a normal user means every kind of like a user can access this thing. You just have to sign in by Google and things like that, and you can boom into the application. Now you have kind of like somebody one privilege. Okay, you get one ticket. Okay, yeah. Now what exactly that ticket means? What? A ticket means that you have kind of like a somebody that kind of like a somebody action is this thing that when you kind of like somebody roadside, you kind of like a seen any kind of like a garbage and things like that, open my application, take a photo, and kind of like a send this is the garbage I found. Okay, yeah. And you send that ticket. Now basically when you send that ticket, it kind of like a send to the ticket to the my server, and in that ticket they have kind of like entire information regarding about when that photo take, what kind of like in the photo, when that photo take, where is that photo is actually should supposed to be taken, what kind of like a somebody the problem that they've been and things like that. Okay, yeah. So basically a normal user will kind of like a somebody knows that this is kind of like a some problem. I took a photo and kind of like a somebody upload on the server. Okay, yeah. Now basically what does it do? My team will kind of like a somebody went into there and kind of like clean that particular garbage. Okay, yeah, this is really cool, really great. Now basically the fun part is that the people who are actually kind of like a working cleaning company, or they are kind of like simply the cleansing garbage or things like that, those are not just kind of like simply the people who are kind of like a beggar or things. No, these are kind of like a ethics, kind of like somebody, any person who can join. Like basically is this thing that if kind of like somebody is this thing that if you wanted to earn little bit amount of money and things like that, you just kind of like open my application and kind of like simply say I am the soldier, or kind of like click the soldier, or kind of like a things. Okay, yeah. Then you became a soldier. Okay, yeah. You will have kind of like a safety jacket and helmet. Okay, yeah. Then you suddenly get popped up that someone kind of like somebody put the kind of like somebody the garbage over there. So what should you supposed to do? Go into that particular location, because ticket is actually went there. So basically go into that particular location and kind of like somebody collect the garbage and kind of like somebody put that garbage into the kind of like plastic. You also kind of like get a little bit of plastic, that you kind of like bring all those plastic and bring all those kind of like some garbage into that plastic and kind of like clean that particular area. Okay, yeah. Then there is a kind of like some garbage truck will game, and it kind of like collect that garbage from you. And basically it's this thing that if you wanted to work even more, so you just have to went to the another ticket. Okay, yeah. And kind of like simply clean that particular stuff. So this is kind of like a things. And basically when you do that thing, you will kind of like get the reward, get the money, get your kind of like in your wallet, you kind of like get some sort of amount of money and things like that. As well as also the people who kind of like somebody took that photo, kind of like somebody he who also understand that who is exactly person who kind of like somebody solve that particular garbage, or kind of like fix that particular garbage. And personally he would kind of like thanks him. It doesn't really require any kind of qualification or things or that. And if I'm kind of like letting me do this thing, it kind of like felt really good. But this kind of like problem, it should somebody solve by the kind of like a ticket and one person. No, definitely not. It kind of like really required kind of like somebody heavy funding and things and that. Now in this particular reality, if my aim, my kind of like assembly, the my execution process, or kind of like the way that I'm solving the problem is kind of like a bit more efficient, bit more kind of like assembly better and things like that. So basically it kind of like assembly more and more people will kind of like invest money on my application or this kind of like a thing. Okay, yeah. So that I would kind of like simply solve the bigger problem and things like that. And basically is this thing, yes, like basically we are leading to the such a world where kind of like simply the people who actually kind of like somebody solve their bigger problem, like startup company, then like basically SpaceX and things, Tesla. These are kind of like some companies who are kind of like somebody wanted to make the future as much as better regarding about having less kind of like assembly the funding and things like that. Because it's really essential that it's not about just the money, it's about the who is exactly that particular person. Okay, yeah, like basically sometimes people are actually kind of like invest money not regarding about the idea but regarding about who's exactly idea belongs to. Okay, yeah, let's just say that this idea belongs to the Elon Musk, then probably most of people are kind of like invest money on Elon Musk because of that they know that Elon Musk is kind of like a person who kind of like solve the bigger problem, so we should supposed to be kind of like invest on his startup and things like that. So this is where kind of like things is actually happen and stuff like that. Okay, yeah. So yes, basically it's this thing. There are kind of like a couple of company who are kind of like something solve the bigger problems and things like that. And basically it's this thing. If this thing is actually happened, if the kind of like somebody our startup is kind of like a judge by the kind of like somebody how much your idea and how do you supposed to well that you will execute and things like that, then kind of like somebody the money will not gonna matter. The government will gonna support and things and that. Now, if I'm gonna say it kind of like sounded really cool and everything really much more better way, like you actually understand that basically the startup company will actually solve the many problems and things and that, but it's somewhat something, it's not exactly right. Okay, because as I mentioned, the people are very crippled. Okay, like basically the people are kind of like somebody utilize this kind of like somebody advantage for wrong purposes too. Okay, let's just say that if the like basically if I'm gonna say in this particular context, so the investor who actually invest money regarding about that how much you kind of like somebody do the social work, then probably is this thing most of people are kind of like doing the social work and things might be a little bit crazy. Example is this thing, let's just say that I'm actually solving the garbage problem. Okay, yeah. So basically what I'm trying to tell you is this thing, I'm kind of like solving the garbage problem which actually exists. But in the future, if this thing actually happened, if my credibility is actually if my credibility if my startup is actually getting funded by the how much good thing that I'm doing, so what I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to create a chaos that I could supposed to be clean. Example is this thing that I would put the garbage to myself, like I put the garbage like somewhere else, yeah, like legitly, and I'm gonna cleaning that mess and I'm kind of like telling that I'm kind of like simply solving that this garbage thing and stuff like that. Like this problem is not even exist. I create this problem and I'm kind of like solve this problem by myself and kind of like somebody getting funding from the kind of like somebody investor and things like that. Now this is completely wrong. Okay, this is completely wrong. And it kind of like somebody create a chaos and things like that. Another thing is that there are so many problems in the social issues. There are so many kind of like a social issues should supposed to be solved and things like that. Like basically some startup company says that thing that I'm gonna solve this kind of like a social issue, but they will not. Like let's just say women's safety. Okay, yeah. Like basically I'm belong to the India and there are so many women's safeties are actually exist. Like they have like there are kind of like a couple of things that we should supposed to be learn women to taekwondo or kind of like a things and that. But problem is that women's safety is actually come from the mindset of the people and things like that. Basically we kind of like let the kind of like some understanding between men and women are kind of like equal and each other. It should supposed to be like basically this problem should supposed to be solved by from the education system. Like basically in our Indian education system, Indian education system are always kind of like a divided regarding about men and women, like girls and boys. And basically because of this thing, our Indian education system never let the girl and boy kind of like became friend from the beginning. So basically not having a friend from the beginning, men always have curiosity regarding about women and women always have curiosity regarding about men, because they don't really get any kind of like somebody intersection. They don't really get any kind of like somebody knows regarding about what does women think, what does men think. Because of that our Indian education system is never really kind of like somebody give them opportunity to kind of like talk with them and things and that. And because of this thing, some people are kind of like somebody very craving regarding about what does women think, and they are kind of like doing this kind of like a rape and really not good stuff and things like that, which is kind of like a really fucked up shit. Okay, yeah. So basically, how does kind of like somebody solve the women's safety? Is kind of like it should supposed to be solved by kind of like somebody since the beginning, since from the education system, since everything. Okay, yeah. So this is where it is lies. Like basically, is this thing all not all the kind of like a social issues actually solved by the kind of like somebody just a problem. It kind of like somebody solved by the kind of like somebody one big problem. When you kind of like solve the one big problem like a education system, then you can solve the multiple problems. Okay, like a safety, like a better education, the women's safety, the kind of like a somebody civilized society and things and that and that. Okay, yeah. Like basically these are all the stuff. Okay, it's not just kind of like a simply one thing can solve. No, it kind of like a simply is this thing that key you have to solve the one big problem, then probably all the kind of like a simply less all the kind of like a simply problems should supposed to be solved. Like if the education system is kind of like a simply properly kind of like a handle, then we should supposed to solve the multiple things like a civilized society, women's safety, great education, so many things, so many things. Okay, yeah. So there are a lot of stuff, dude, lot of stuff. And basically if you wanted to kind of like solve so much bigger social issues, it really required kind of like not only just the money supports and but still a lot of things, and it really required kind of like a courage, and it kind of like a facing a lot of problems. Okay, because in this thing when you try to solve the social issues, or when you try to solve the our startup system is kind of like a solve that particular social issues, then probably is this thing that key you need a kind of like a more than money, you need kind of like a lot of stuff and stuff like that. And people might not have that particular stuff. Okay, yeah. So basically it's this thing. Okay, yeah. Can kind of like a simply the startup system or any kind of like a startup who can they solve the social issues and things like that? Yes, they can, but still they really require kind of like a simply more than money, like a courage. Okay, yeah, because courage is a very essential thing. If they don't really have that much courage, then how they supposed to be have a kind of like a somebody something that to kind of like a face all those problems and things and that. Because let me tell you one thing, kind of like a somebody doing a startup in the kind of like a normal company, just kind of like a, just a typical thing. When you try to solve the social issues, then probably it will kind of like a create chaos, people not really believe in you and things and that. There is a lot of stuff is actually happened. So yeah. Okay, yeah. But by the way, it's kind of like a really good to kind of like a talk about this thing. If the kind of like a startup is kind of like a focus on world's problem, like a social issues or things or that and that, then this might be really good. We are kind of like entering such a world, and basically we are entering such a world. Like basically there are so many startup system who are kind of like a working for that. Like some of the kind of like I kind of like a seen a kind of like a startup system who kind of like a clean the ocean. Okay, which kind of like a really good idea and things like that, but still the implementation of the cleaning the ocean is kind of like actually far more bigger, because the ocean is kind of like a way much bigger than okay, yeah, it really required if our startup system is kind of like actually based on how do we supposed to clean up the ocean, then probably we need a kind of like a support system from the globe. Okay, from every countries and things and that, and then only then we could solve this thing. Okay, because is this thing na ki there is a lot of thing. Okay, talking about that particular stuff is whatever. I should supposed to be end here. Okay, this is what I think about the startup and how they could supposed to be solve the world big problem and things like that. All right, this is it, and thank you.